So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome everyone to the first public event of the Bernstein Conference 2014. First of all, we want to thank the organizers of this conference, especially Prof.Giulio as the head of conference, and all the people who helped us with organizing this event, like Kerstin Mosch, Regina Wunderlich, Victoria Novak, and also the BFNT, BCCN, Bernstein Association, and the BMBF for providing the funds to invite those wonderful speakers. A huge thanks also goes to the speakers for making that long journey to Goettingen, and a big thanks to all of you for the great interest in the mystery of consciousness. A mystery which, according to Daniel Dennett, often leaves the most sophisticated thinkers tongue-tied and confused. And we hope this won't happen to our speakers today. We will start the evening with Professor Joseph Levy. He received his PhD from Harvard in 1981, and after positions in Boston University, the Bates College, North Carolina State, and Ohio State University, he is now the head of the Department of Philosophy in UMass Amherst. Besides political philosophy, he's also, or mainly, working on the philosophy of mind, especially on the philosophy of consciousness. And in his field, he authored numerous scientific publications and also popular books. And one of them is a book called Purple Haze, The Puzzle of Consciousness, which chapters are all titled by lines from the famous Jimi Hendrix songs, which is quite an accomplishment. And one of his most renowned results is the so-called explanatory gap argument, which has somehow influenced our title. And we hope he will explain this in his talk. Please welcome Professor Joseph Levy.
Is it working now? Yes. Okay, turning it on always makes a difference. Well, first of all, thank you very much to the organizers of the conference for inviting me, to all of you for showing up. I know this is a neuroscience conference, and there is a way in which everything I have to say will be as if from Mars, but I hope that's not too much of a problem. And I also want to give a special thanks to Michael, Manuel, and Marcus, the three students who have been organizing and who have shown me a fantastic time the last couple of days, taking me to all kinds of places I hadn't seen, and in particular to see Frege's house, which I made sure I had a picture of. Okay. I'm adapting. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, there aren't a lot of slides, and I'm mostly just going to talk through. And this title actually comes from another talk I gave, but it seemed particularly appropriate for this talk here. So the session is called Mind the Gap. So what I'm trying to do is at least give you an idea from a philosopher's point of view about why there's at least the feeling and the deep puzzle that surrounds conscious experience and where this gap actually is. Now, let's hope that things work. Yes? It seems so. Okay, good. So let me just start by saying what I think the mind-body problem is. So the philosophy of mind over the centuries has been, to a large extent, defined by the notion of the mind-body problem. So what is the mind-body problem anyway? It's not the only issue in philosophy of mind. There are many others, but it's certainly the overarching one that people have been most worried about. So the intuitive characterization of what the mind-body problem is the following question. Is the mind, or mental activity or mental phenomena, I'm not going to worry about the difference between those two right now, something over and above? This is a phrase you hear quite often. Is it something over and above the body and its activity? And of course, big problem is, well, how do you characterize this notion of over and above? What does that amount to? And of course, as you might imagine, there is a ton of literature about this. And so I'm just going to give you a quick characterization of how I see this notion of over and above. So I begin by saying, let's divide the properties and relations in the world into two kinds. What I'll call basic kinds, or fundamental. I'm going to use the words basic and fundamental interchangeably. And those that are realized, or in fact, I'm a little more fond of the term now, constructible. All right. And so what is the difference between the two? Well, let's assume for the moment that reality, what there is, the universe, the world, however you want to call it, is constituted by objects that have properties and that stand in certain relations. All right? That's what there is. There are objects, very small ones, very big ones. They stand in relations to each other and they have certain properties. And you can always ask the following question. When you're trying to understand how it is that a certain object happens to either instantiate or possess a certain property or stand in a certain relation, is that something that's part of the fundamental furniture of the world? Or is it something that arises in an intelligible way, is in some sense constructible out of other more fundamental properties and relations? So I take it, I know a lot of you are physicists, so I really hesitate to talk about physics here. In my philosophy classes, to my undergraduates, I can say all kinds of things, but I have to be very careful who people hear. But I take it that what physics is, to a large extent, is an investigation into the fundamental nature of reality, trying to figure out what are the fundamental properties and relations, and objects as well. And of course, what we find as physics has developed is that notions about object and properties and the like are become extremely weird, right? From the point of view of common sense. So, are they really objects? Are they just fields? Are they just space-time? Right? But whatever that is, there's some fundamental reality here. Now, I am making an assumption that I think in the end doesn't matter for this debate, but it's certainly a simplifying assumption, that there actually is a fundamental level of reality. I know that it's a disputed question. I don't know if it's actually how much disputed in physics, but I know it is in philosophy, about whether the levels just keep going. It's turtles all the way down, as they say. And for my purposes, that doesn't really matter. But I'm going to assume that there are certain properties and relations and objects that are fundamental from the point of view of physics, and that you can't explain how they are possessed by objects in terms of anything more fundamental. Right? I mean, just as an example, this is probably not a good example anymore, but at least when I was growing up, things like negative or positive charge were taken to be fundamental features. So that's the sort of thing I have in mind. So let's call those the basic properties and relations. Then, of course, there are other ones. So let me give you as an example one that I think would count as a realized or constructible one, and take liquidity. Right? Water is liquid. Now, I think for Aristotle, who thought water was a fundamental substance, one of the basic objects that provided out of which everything was constructed, liquidity might have been a basic property. I don't know if Aristotle ever talked about liquidity, but I imagine, given his view about water there was nothing more to say. Water just is essentially liquid. That's it. There's nothing more to say about it. It isn't constructed out of any other basic, more fundamental property. On the other hand, now we know, no, there's a whole story. Water turns out to be a whole bunch of different particles, and liquidity, this property of conforming to the shape of containers but not filling the entire volume, that distinguishes it from solidity and being a gas, turns out can be constructed out of the ways in which the little particles are related to each other and bonded, and then you can you get the macro property of liquidity. So that's what I mean by a case I'd say liquidity is not a basic property. It's realized or constructed out of other properties. Okay? So with that distinction in mind, I then want to say the following. So materialism, this is the taking one side of the mind-body problem, right? So materialism in the philosophy of mind is the doctrine or the thesis that mental properties and relations are all non-basic or realized. That is, that the mental is somehow constructible, realized in the non-mental. Okay. Not surprisingly, anti-materialism, and notice I say anti-materialism as opposed to dualism. For most purposes, that can mean the same thing. I sometimes feel a little hesitant to think that dualism is the only way of being an anti-materialist, but leave that terminological issue aside. Dualism or anti-materialism is then the thesis that at least some, and it's important about the some because I'm going to make a distinction among certain mental properties, that at least some mental properties and relations are basic. They are fundamental elements of reality. Okay? And that's the debate. And so therefore, what does it mean to say the mind is something over and above the body? It's to say mental properties and relations are basic in a certain way, not constructible out of physical properties and relations. And of course, to be a materialist in denying that the mind is something over and above is to say that it is constructible. Now, I'm very fond of this particular formulation of materialism because it avoids a debate that at least has occupied philosophers for some time, and that I myself find pointless, but then again, who am I to talk? I engage in pointless debates all the time. But so this formulation avoids a debate about what the physical means. See, many people have many philosophers have expressed the doctrine of materialism or physicalism in terms of something like, saying something like, everything is physical. And immediately, as soon as you say that, you run into this problem. What is physical? What counts as physical? And indeed, Noam Chomsky, though he doesn't write too much about this issue, but has actually weighed in philosophy of mind in this particular area about the mind-body problem. And he has written, maybe some of you have seen this, quite emphatically, that he thinks there is no mind-body problem anymore, not because he thinks it's been solved, but because he thinks it can't even be formulated. He thinks there's no sense to be made. He said, during the days of Descartes and Newton, it made sense. We had a conception of body that was limited, right? It was this mechanical conception. There were these things that were bulky and they bumped into each other. And yes, we had a positive conception of body and the physical. And then he says, with modern physics, there's no constraint on what can end up being physical. And so therefore, there's no contrast that one can make. And indeed, I do think it would be a fool's errand, as we say, to try to give a definition of the physical. Because there is some sense in which the physical is going to turn out to be whatever physics says it is. However, I don't think you need to do that. I don't think to formulate the issue in philosophy of mind, I don't think it's important that you have a positive, constrained conception of the physical. I think what really matters here is that you have a positive conception of the mental. And really what philosophers of mind are concerned with are not concerned with the ultimate constituents of reality. Maybe philosophers of physics are, but philosophers of mind, that's not their problem. They want to know, what about the mental? Is it fundamental? Or is it something that's constructed out of whatever that other stuff is that physicists finally come up with? Now, it does demand that you have some positive conception of the mental, and I do think we do have one. I don't know if that's readable. And that is, I think there are two kinds of features, two kinds of properties that make a phenomenon count as mental. One of them, The second one I have here is intentionality. So one of, Brentano famously said intentionality is a mark of the mental. What is intentionality? To my mind, intentionality is fundamentally this idea of one thing being about something else. Having something else as its content in a certain way. Most, and I'll use the word physical, understanding that, that's a shorthand for whatever it is that physics comes up with. Most physical objects do not have intentional features. This table does not, right? I don't think my liver does, right? They have lots of features, lots of properties, but those properties don't involve they're in some way being about something else. The mind has this feature that right here, right now, I can be in a state that has Amherst, Massachusetts as its content, as something it's about. I can now, I wouldn't be doing it right this very minute while I'm talking, but not long before I came here, by the way, being head of department is no honor. It means you're everyone's slave. So right now, before I came here, what I had on my plate was somebody emails me about some problem in the university that I've got to do something about as soon as I get there. So I'm in a state here worrying about something going on, 5,000, however many miles away. That's an interesting feature. And the question is, can that be constructed out of more fundamental features? And if it can, then it doesn't matter whether or not those other things count as physical in some other sense. And the other feature, the one I'm going to talk more about, is consciousness. Now, just as a preview, there are many philosophers who theorize that these two really collapse, but for the moment, at least traditionally, they have been treated as somewhat separately. I say traditionally, meaning mostly in the 20th century. I don't think Descartes would have made a difference between these two. But, so what is consciousness? Well, to some extent, that's going to be what the rest of the talk is about, but basically, it's that aspect of our mental life in terms of which you can say it has a sort of subjective component. It's there being something that's like for us. Okay? So those two features, if a phenomenon involves a subject who is having a sort of experience, or a subject or an entity that's in a state that has intentionalities about something else, then we want to say at least some features of it, that these are mental features. And then the mind-body problem is to ask, can those features be constructed out of properties and relations that do not involve those features? The way liquidity is constructed out of bonds between molecules that are not themselves liquidity. All right, that's the idea. Okay. Oh, one thing I wanted to say before I go on to this. This idea of construction that I'm talking about, or realization, has actually two sides to it. It has a metaphysical or ontological side, and it has an epistemological or explanatory side. So, liquidity would be what it is. I take it there was water that was liquid long before there was any conscious life on this earth, right? 2 billion years ago, whatever, there was water and it was liquid. And I take it that liquidity of that water was constructed out of the molecules. The molecules didn't come into existence when we started hypothesizing about molecules, right? So that's the metaphysical side. What's the fact of the matter? Is it constructed or not? But then there's an epistemological side, and that's where this phrase explanatory gap comes from. Is there a theory that explains and makes intelligible to us how it is that the constructed properties are constructed out of the more fundamental ones? That's the epistemological side. And I don't think they automatically, I don't think it's a conceptual truth that the two have to go together. So what I originally argued when I first talked about the explanatory gap was that, in fact, it's probably the case that materialism is true. We have overwhelming reasons to think it must be true. However, we can't really see how it could be true. There isn't any theory that explains the construction in a way that makes it intelligible or transparent to us. I'm now thinking you at least, even though you don't have a knockdown deductive argument from the existence of an explanatory gap to there being a genuine gap in nature, that is, to the claim that materialism must be false, I do think that you could try to run what we sometimes call an inference to the best explanation. So one interesting hypothesis might be, you know why there's this epistemic gap? You know why there's no explanation that is intelligible to us? Because it isn't really constructed, that's why. Because it really is a fundamental part of reality. All right. And more, I'm becoming sympathetic to that inference. But nevertheless, I don't think it's absolutely forced on me. This is where I differ from a philosopher like David Chalmers, who defends dualism based on the claim that from the epistemic gap you can conclusively infer that there's a metaphysical gap. I don't think you can do that, and my arguments with him have to do with differences about semantic theories that he relies on, and I feel shouldn't be relied on. But that's a story for another day. Okay, but if I did say there's an explanatory gap here, the question is, so what is it that needs explaining? And I've already mentioned it a bit, but let me expand on that. What needs explaining is this, and it's captured very well by this very famous paper of Thomas Nagel that I think even non-philosophers sometimes are aware of, but the paper is called What Is It Like to Be That? But he captures this notion of consciousness in the phrase, what is it like? So let's look at a phrase like, what it's like for X to experience Y, and see what are the issues that actually need explaining there. So this, I think you can extract from this phrase, and here, by the way, I don't mean to argue that semantic analysis on the phrase is revelatory of this is where our views about consciousness come from. I just think that the phrase itself really nicely captures the two fundamental aspects of conscious experience. The first one is what I call subjectivity. After all, it says what it's like for X, right? What it's like for me now to hear my voice being projected, right? What it's like for you to see me standing here, right? So there's subjectivity. There's something for the subject that has to be captured. What is this feature of subjectivity? And in particular, I want to emphasize that I think sometimes in the philosophy literature, even among dualists, people think that mental properties, even if they're basic, are somehow just instantiated, possessed by mind. And I think there's a huge difference between an object just possessing a property, the way this table possesses the property or instantiates the property of solidity, and actually experiencing the property. That's something only conscious subjects do. All objects possess properties, but only conscious subjects experience them. And that's what we're trying to capture by that notion of for the subject. The second aspect of conscious experience is captured by the what in what it's like, right? Particularly, what is it like? Is it reddish, greenish? Is it painful? Is it sweet? Taste? Those are the qualia that philosophers have talked about, the qualitative properties that we actually seem to experience. Okay? There's something common among all the conscious experiences, namely the subjectivity. Every conscious experience is an experience for a subject, but the particular qualitative contents, of course, differ all over the place. So those are the two issues, those are the two features of conscious experience that I think need explained. And notice that this idea of qualia connects up very much with the traditional distinction between the primary and secondary qualities. If you look at the literature from the modern philosophers who made distinctions between what was called primary and secondary qualities, I don't know if everyone's familiar with that, but Locke in particular is one of the main discussions, talked about solidity and motion and shape being primary qualities, but things like sweet taste, red color, painful feeling, these were what he called the secondary qualities of objects. And they were thought to be problematic in a certain way, right? How to account for them in terms of the primary qualities. And Locke basically said, well, you can't. Really, in the object, in some sense he wanted to say, in the object you're perceiving, there really are just the primary qualities. But when you arrange primary qualities in a certain way, and he really thought of it as sort of like spatial arrangement, they have the power to cause in our minds these secondary qualities to appear. But which primary quality goes with which secondary quality he thought was completely arbitrary. He in fact appealed to God. He said God had to decide. Redness goes with that light wave, you know. Taste goes with that chemical. Sweetness goes with that chemical. Right? This is not explicable. Right? And that's really part of the puzzle that we're talking about. So one of the things that seems to distinguish these qualitative properties from the secondary from the primary, or the qualia from other properties, this seems both redundant and unilluminating, and I wish I had actually a better term, but a better way of expressing it, but I think it's part of the whole issue that we don't have another way of expressing it. But that qualia seem to be what I want to call purely qualitative. And that seems very different from the other kinds of properties that we talk about that objects possess, or the so-called primary qualities. They all seem to have they're either structural or functional. Now, what do I mean by structural? I just mean, you know, the way something is arranged in terms of shape and spatial and relations, that kind of thing, as structural. And by functional, I mean what role a particular item plays within some kind of causal network. So if you want to say, so what is negative charge anyway? Well, it's that feature that when something has it, causes it to attract positively charged things. Well, what is positive charge? Well, it's that feature, right? And you can say, if you think about all of the kinds of primary qualities that are discussed in most of the natural sciences, they really all come down to structural or functional properties. It's either a matter of how something's put together spatially, or what role it plays within some larger causal system. And that, I mean, so functional, the way it's used in philosophy of mind, is not necessarily having to do with purpose or function, but rather just a role within a causal network. That just doesn't seem to be the case with qualia or secondary qualities. They don't seem to be merely roles within systems. They're not structural, and they're not functional. Okay? Or at least on the surface, that certainly seems to be the case. Obviously, part of the whole debate is whether you can capture the qualitative aspect in terms of function or structure. Okay, this is the last slide, but there's a lot packed in. All right, so we have these two aspects. We have the subjectivity, something being for the subject in a certain way, and then we also have this qualitative feature. They're these purely qualitative properties. And my hypothesis is they go together. How to understand precisely why they go together the way they do, I'm not sure, and I don't have a good theory of that, but it does seem that the qualitative properties themselves only appear in the context of experience. And experience seems to be largely a matter of confronting these purely qualitative properties. Why there's an intimate and essential connection between those two is, I think, an interesting issue that I would like to get clear about in my mind. But all right, suppose you wanted to say, look, we can overcome this gap, we can actually give an explanation. What are the explanatory reductive strategies that have actually been proposed philosophically, especially in the last, from sort of the second half of the 20th century on? And so I want to mention sort of three kinds of strategies that I think have to some extent exhausted the strategies that people have used, and then say a little bit about why I find them unsatisfying. Right. So the first one is functionalism. So one of the earliest views about how to understand mentality, and especially how to understand qualitative experience, things like, you know, the redness of a rose and the sweetness of sugar and that kind of thing, was to say that, look, these features of the mind are actually merely, in some, merely functional properties. That is, you can understand what it is to have an experience of red by understanding what causal role that experience plays in mediating between stimuli that come into to the mind or to the brain and internal connections with other states, and then behavioral output. Now, that kind of functionalism was, to a large extent, I mean, there are, I guess, still philosophers who are pure functionalists in this sense now, but it ran into a lot of problems. And one of the problems it ran into was that if you're going to try to understand these purely qualitative properties in terms of these roles, you run up, one kind of problem you run up against is that it seems quite imaginable that you can have systems that define certain roles that have a certain axis of symmetry, so that you could imagine inversions. Right? So the standard case, which I know that, you know, when you actually do the vision science, it gets more complicated than this, but the standard case that was mentioned is spectrum inversion. Right? So if you think of, at least for the moment, just for the moment, think about a hue and leave aside brightness and saturation. Right? You can define a point on the color wheel in terms, to some extent, of its relations to other points, but of course, if you flip it over, right, and you make enough compensatory changes, then one person's reddish experience could play the same functional role that another person's greenish experience does. Right? And then they could respond to objects exactly the same way. Of course, they call them the same things, but there's nothing special about the words, right? And it just looks like you can't capture the purely qualitative aspect. As you might think of it, the absolute value of the quality can't be captured. All that can be captured are relative differences. And the problem is that while maybe for certain properties like charge and mass and things of that sort, the role in the system is sufficient to capture it. I mean, I don't know if it makes sense even to talk about two separate universes where one property plays the mass role here and the other one plays their mass. Right? What else is there to mass, right? But it seems to make perfect sense to talk about a difference between red and green that's, as it were, an absolute difference. That one has a value, as it were, a qualitative value that is not captured merely by its relative difference to other qualities. And if that's true, then that's problematic. The functional account won't work. Now, again, I want to say that these thought experiments, I mean, again, in philosophy of mind, often the attention has been focused too much on the thought experiments, not enough about what the underlying insight, or at least intuition, is supposed to be that fuels the thought experiment. So a lot of people have tried to show, no, there are ways to block the symmetry. You can't actually map red onto green in that way, and people have gotten caught up in a lot of the details of some of these thought experiments. To me, they're just illustrations of something more underlying, which is we don't really understand. We have a conception of a quality that we get from our first-person encounter with these qualities. It's part of our subjective experience. And all the third-person so-called objective descriptions give us are things like role and structure. And the fact that that doesn't make intelligible how you can actually capture the, as I'm calling it, the absolute value of the pure quality is illustrated by the fact that we can imagine these odd scenarios, like inversion. I don't actually think you see red differently than I do. I mean, there might be senses of shifts in people's spectrums where they actually do see colors differently. Right? I know that blue and green and where unique green is and stuff is notoriously variable across the population. Right? But those, of course, are functionally characterizable differences. Right? And I'm assuming that we aren't different in these ways. Though it is a question, an objection to the view I'm making is, why am I so confident about that? I have to admit, I don't know that I have a good answer. All right, that just in case that I was giving you an objection, that now you can't raise it. All right, but this pure functional account, many people thought, okay, you're right, somehow the internal role isn't good enough. And what people thought was, no, we need to add intentionality here. We need to add representation. And so a very popular view, I would have to say, if you're a materialist, I think this is the way to go, is representationalism. Basically saying, look, what makes your red experience red is that you're in a state that is a mental representation of some feature of the world, and it picks out just that feature. Now, what feature? Let's say, to a first approximation, a spectral reflectance. All right? Now, that turns out to be complicated, but it's close enough. It's probably a set of spectral reflectance. And that's what it is. And the particular, you can distinguish the particular spectral reflectances that make a surface red versus the ones that make a surface green. And that isn't merely defined in terms of the relations to each other. The problem is, of course, that representationalism, first of all, has to give you the right theory of intentionality, how it is that some state in me actually does focus on a particular spectral reflectance, and it turns out how to construct the intentional out of the non-intentional is also a very deep problem. But I'm going to let that one go, because I think perhaps that could be solved. But here again, it seems to me that it doesn't still get at explain the pure quality. There's nothing about the spectral reflectance of a surface that explains the redness I experience as opposed to anything else. The connection seems just as arbitrary between the surface property of the object and the redness I experience as between some neural configuration and the redness. So I don't think it actually helps. What I'm calling computationalism is actually a combination of functionalism and representationalism. Right? So I happen to think that something like the computational theory of mind is actually quite the right way to go for certain kinds of things that I'll get to in a moment. And the idea here is that we basically understand the mind as a system of representations that stand in certain kinds of computational relations to each other, where those computational relations have a formal structure of inference and composition, all of those things that we know how to build into a computer that derive ultimately from what we learned from formal logic. Right? So you've got these tokens, they stand in these kinds of relations to each other, and then you add meaning by talking about how they might be causally connected to the world in such a way, and you have a device that is able to reason about it, right, and infer features of the world from other states. Now, I've been talking for the moment, when I mentioned functionalism and representationalism, I've been focusing on the attempt to capture the qualitative aspect. The other aspect is subjectivity. Certain kinds of computational theories try to capture, and to a certain extent, it makes sense, because when you think about something being conscious for a subject, an experience being conscious, a lot of it seems to have to do with a notion that Ned Block has called access. Right, that there's this notion of access consciousness. Something's conscious if I can report on it. Something's conscious, representation is conscious if I can use it in planning, right? If it is, and then there are lots of different ways to try to expand that. So for instance, there are these global workspace theories, general broadcast theories, but basically the idea is if some representation is accessible to other systems, and particularly central systems, executive control, things of that sort, then it's conscious. Now that is a notion I do think can be characterized from the third person point of view, and it's a notion that certainly has an important use, but it also, to me, doesn't capture that aspect of an experience involving something that's actually presented to me as a conscious subject. It doesn't capture that. It seems to me you can have all of this access and still have something that doesn't have the kind of subjectivity that I'm talking about. And therefore, I think it fails. Now, that's a bold claim. I throw it out because I only have 5 minutes more anyway. So, and I'm sure we'll return to that. So, what I did want to say, sort of in closing, is that I do think that there is a theory of the mind that can be characterized and couched from the third person point of view. There are really important problems that psychology and cognitive science deal with, where they give answers that genuinely show how certain kinds of mental features are constructed out of non-mental features. So, for instance, we have all these, what I'm calling here generally behavioral capacities, but I don't mean to be behaviorist here, but I mean in terms, broadly speaking, we start with the idea that people seem to have all kinds of behavioral abilities. Just for a quick example, you take a human infant, right, that doesn't know a word of English or German or whatever, you stick them in a household where they speak some natural language, and wait 4 years or 5 years or 3 years, however much you want to, whatever you want to consider the cutoff, and they're jabbering away. How does that happen? Well, I think that, as Chomsky showed and as others have shown in psycholinguistics, that's a really deep and interesting and important problem. But it's not the kind of problem about which I have any reason to think that there's ultimately an explanatory gap. I think, yes, you have to posit certain kinds of computational mechanisms, probably a lot of innate ones. This is, of course, debated, right? But it's pretty clear how you proceed. You come up with a model, right, defined in terms of certain kinds of representational capacities and mechanisms, and then you see how, if it's given certain input, it's capable of giving certain output. Right? And we have ways to check on that. whether they're successful or not. I'm not by any means meaning to claim that these are easy problems. I know David Chalmers is famous for talking about the hard problem, the easy problem. Of course, most of what you call the easy problems are very hard, right? And that's what most of your conference is about, is just how hard these so-called easy problems can be. But nevertheless, they don't seem to give us these kinds of, in principle, questions. Well, but how could that possibly be? How is that intelligible? It seems to me, no, it's quite intelligible, and then we just have to find out, well, what are those mechanisms? So I do think there is even a chance of, these theories that are, these third-person point of view theories that require these kinds of computational mechanisms, it is important that we add intentionality to them. After all, we aren't just internal systems that are formal systems that are having states that interact in these gloriously complex ways. After all, every physical object is one of those. These are systems whose states are representations that are interacting in these ways. And to be representations, we've got to have some view about how these internal states get to be about things like Amherst, Massachusetts, and the moon, and whatever I happen to think about. But there, too, I'm not, while I don't think any philosophical theory that's come along yet has been able to really show how representation and intentional content can be constructed out of certain kinds of causal relations among physical objects, I don't see a principal reason why that couldn't happen. Right? It doesn't seem unintelligible to me how a certain kind of causal relation between myself and certain objects, how could that be the state of mind representing that? I don't find myself puzzled in the same way. However, when it comes to something being literally for me in the way that an experience is, and it's a property that has no structural or functional analog, as far as I can tell, or no structural or functional underlying basis, then I feel, yes, there is something, if it's a bridgeable gap, unbridgeable. So far, it's not clear to me how we would bridge that gap. And that's where I think the problem of consciousness lies. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Ich wohl weiter mich nach hinten orientieren, danke.
Okay, so this was the first part. For those of you who have questions, there will be time later. We will directly continue with the second talk. The second speaker will be Prof.Giulio Tononi. He studied medicine in Pisa, did his PhD there, neurobiology, and he had faculty positions in Ford and San Diego, and is now at the University of Wisconsin in medicine, where he has the chair for sleep and consciousness science. He has written many, many books and papers, which have received a lot of attention and many citations. In 2005, he has received an award from the National Institute of Health for his work on the functions of sleep. And today, he's going to present something which I find very fascinating. He has developed a theory, a quantitative theory for consciousness, which is quite unique, and that will be the topic of his talk.
Thank you to Manuel, Marcus, and Michael. And I have to add also a thank you to Joseph because he gave an ideal introduction to what I'm going to say, pointing out exactly what the problem is, as he did quite some time ago, and veering, as I understand, towards a position to which I'm even more sympathetic. What I'm going to do today is impossible, so I won't do it. I spent an hour and a half, and that was not good enough to go through the first few slides I'll show you before in the tutorial. This is not something that can be, as I like to say, swallowed whole. Nevertheless, at least perhaps you get some taste for it. You may like the cooking or not. Okay. The theory I'm going to talk about is called integrated information theory. I will call it IIT from now. And what I want to point out, if it shows up, is that the subtitle is From Phenomenology to Mechanisms and Back. So what is crucial here, very much in the light of what Joseph said, is that it is essential to start from experience itself, from phenomenology itself. Forget about starting from the so-called physical world. You'll never get consciousness out of that. And back, it means there is some hope that we can even do some science and ask very important questions, which Joseph didn't mention, but are obviously implicit in what he said. We really want to know what has this subjective experience, as he put it, this qualitativeness, the qualia. We want to know that. We want to know this, whether it's humans, patients in a vegetative state, are they really there, not there, or they may be there, and we just can't access them. Animals, how many of them are conscious, how much, and which way? We want to know that. It makes a big difference to how we treat them. And computers, who now are going to do very much the same things we do, better and better. Are they like us just because they behave like us? Or there is nothing it is like to be one of them? So these are rather important questions. We can't just say this is a philosophical issue. This is a fundamental issue and has enormous ethical implications. It should be obvious to everyone, including to the projection system. All right. All right. In the meantime, let me tell you a couple of things that, again, should be obvious, but they always deserve some clarification. One is, what's the simple-minded definition of consciousness, just to know what we are talking about, because it's great confusion. Consciousness, I like to say, is what goes away when you fall into dreamless sleep or somebody hits you in the head. Okay? We all know that everything goes away. Everything, as far as you are concerned. And that is sort of like saying that consciousness is synonymous with experience. So from now on, consciousness is experience. Any experience, and the experience I like the most for consciousness is darkness and silence. Almost nothing. Okay? There's nothing complicated there. Yet, it is an experience. It is like something to have that. The second thing that I could say is that we have to remember that what is called variably higher order consciousness, self-consciousness, reflective consciousness, are all kinds of names. That's a part of consciousness. I may be thinking about consciousness itself, what is the distinction between perception and thought, or whatever else. That's a component of our consciousness. But just rushing through the jungle, or skiing down the slope very fast, you have experiences without any self-reflection, and yet that is consciousness. So it's synonymous with any experience. Maybe I will start mine. Let's do that. It's coming? All right. So the other thing I'll say in the meantime is that, talking about intentionality, it doesn't even have anything to do necessarily here and now with the outside world. Because of something we all know, an experiment we conduct every night, you dream. And when you dream, you have experience, but it's not about anything out there. Okay? It just happens within you. It happens several hours per night. And finally, for this, I really need the screen. Okay, let's just see. I will start mine. Let's see. Let me try this now. Let me disconnect myself. Well, I very good. All right, I'll go through my slides. Consciousness is what goes away in sleep. It's not just higher order consciousness. You have it when you dream without the world out there, and you come to the explanatory gap. Okay, this is a classic quotation of the explanatory gap, if you wish, by Thomas Huxley, by many others. And the point is exactly what Joseph was saying. Okay, in all kind of other things, I can sort of have an intelligible explanation, but here I don't seem to have it, and he was insinuating that maybe it's because it's something fundamental that cannot just be reduced to what we call the physical world. Okay? I completely agree with that. Now, scientists, when finally they had the courage to say they work on consciousness, which is sort of a late development, they go for what has been called by Christoph Koch and Francis Crick the neural correlates of consciousness. Meaning we can